How would you feel if someone called you a Luddite? For generations, that word has been used as a form of name-calling, suggesting a person is anti-technology and backward thinking. But in some circles, the meaning of Luddite is changing, especially among activists who are fighting against some of the uses of AI. I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in US cities.
As the disc rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte I present to you Electro, the Moto Man.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, we explore what it means to be a modern-day Luddite.
I haven't even gotten a new iPhone for 6 years. I'm such a Luddite. I've never been on TikTok. I'm such a Luddite. Or I hate self-driving cars. I won't get in one. I'm a Luddite. None of which are actually representative of what the original Luddites were all about. I'm Brian Merchant, tech journalist and the author of Blood in the Machine, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech. The Luddites were a band of rebels, basically, cloth workers in the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution, who, after trying various peaceful measures for a long, long time to make sure that their working lives and their identities and their trades were protected from the march of what we would refer to today as automation, found themselves with their backs against the walls. Tech companies of the day, entrepreneurs of the day, were using machines that automated work that sort of did their jobs worse, shoddier, and more cheaply, changed course. And they started fighting, and they started doing the thing that would come to define them. That's smashing the machines that were taking their jobs. They organized around this fictitious, apocryphal sort of figure, Ned Ludd, who was probably just completely made up or may have been an apprentice cloth worker who wasn't working as fast as his master wanted him to. So his master had him whipped, and he, enraged, took a giant hammer and smashed the machine that he had been working on, fled into Sherwood Forest like Robin Hood before him. They were both in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, and sort of the legend grew, right? He's Ned Ludd, so the people who followed in his footsteps, smashing the machinery of oppression, were the Luddites, and they organized themselves into a big guerrilla force that could oppose sort of the forces of industrialization, the elites, and sort of the British crown all at once.
The word basically has had a negative connotation ever since, but you wrote an interesting piece for The Atlantic. The term is suddenly in vogue. Yeah, it's being reclaimed by people who are increasingly kind of turning to this history as a little bit of a contextualizing source, because a lot of the things that happened 200 years ago, the Luddites rose up in 1811, so about 210 years ago or so. The conditions are very similar in a lot of ways to what's happening today with AI and sort of gig work, where big companies, powerful people, and rich people with a lot of access to resources are using technologies in a certain way. They're adopting AI in ways that might threaten writers, artists, ordinary workers. The gig app companies are turning to, industries that had been organized a certain way for a long time and basically saying we can do this with a, peer-to-peer platform now where we take a cut of it, but also sort of cut out the part where, you get benefits. And it started with Uber and it started with Lyft. And now it's sort of this gig work model is moving on to bigger sectors of the economy like healthcare and so forth. And all the while, workers are feeling like it's pushing them into more precarious situations. So a lot of people are recognizing these forces and the similarities to the original Luddites. And they're saying, hey, the Luddites were not dummies. The Luddites, in fact, use technology in their lives every day for hundreds of years. If you're a cloth worker, if you're a weaver using a hand loom in a cottage, or if you're a stocking frame worker using it to knit goods, or if you're, working a cloth finishing device, a gig mill, all of these things were technologies that they had really firsthand knowledge of how to use, and they were opposing these changes, not because they hated the technology, but because they hated how it was being used against them. And so we find ourselves in a similar situation today, where artists are saying, hey, wait a minute. And I've talked to many of them in my work as a journalist, who are seeing, up to 50% of their work sort of dry up because they used to draw illustrations for a company that can now do that with Midjourney, or a copywriter that used to work for a corporation. Now they can, use ChatGPT to get some approximation of it. And so these sort of already precarious jobs are kind of drying up a little bit in a way that is very contested, because there's, just like the cloth workers 200 years ago who complained about the quality and the methods of their work being stolen by the machines, and all the labor that they'd put into building a reputation and so forth of England's cloth industry. The machine owners were capitalizing on that, automating large parts of it, using children to run the machines for less cost, and then putting out an inferior product. While artists today say, hey, all of this stuff has been stolen from work we've put on the internet. It's been vacuumed up into these systems that a tech company is going to profit off of to churn out an inferior product. And it's going to not only deprive us of a chance to make a living selling our work, but it's also going to drive the market down in general for the prices for this stuff, because now we're competing with an automated system. So the similarities are so numerous, and the Luddites, I think, are increasingly seen as sympathetic and not reactionary or dumb, because really that mischaracterization is the result of a propaganda campaign, to kind of put it bluntly, by the crown at the time, that really had an interest in, the Luddites when they first rose up were really popular. People would join them in the streets, people from other trades who weren't in obvious threat of being automated away in their workplaces. The steel workers, the coal workers, the shoemakers, hatters, they would all come out and they'd join the Luddites. And even some of the authorities at the time would just kind of let them attack the shops. Part of that is because the Luddites were very tactical. And at first, especially, they would only destroy the machines that were automating their work. They would leave all the other machinery that didn't sort of disrupt the social contract in place. And they would sort of write threatening letters explaining why they were doing what they were doing. They'd give the factory owners an opportunity to take down the automating machines, and they would be blunt. They said, you have erased, 300 of our brothers' jobs, and take down the machines or you'll get a visit from Ned Ludd. That's how they would, write their letters and go about their campaign. And if they complied, Ned Ludd's army wouldn't show up. But if they didn't, if they kept the machines up, then they'd either sneak through the window or hold up the overseer at gunpoint, and they'd take that hammer to those machines. And it was twofold. It was a symbolic tactic, right? Saying like, these are the machines being used by the rich to get even richer. If we destroy them, we're also sort of dealing a blow to these forces that are making society more unequal, less just. And so people could get behind that. They were also very tactical, right? You destroy the machine that can, do the work that has caused you to lose a job. Economies were much less complex. We didn't have globalization to the same degree. Your town was probably a cloth producing town if you were in the Luddite sort of sphere of influence. If you smash the machine in the factory that's doing your job, then they can't use it to take your job anymore. So it served both purposes, and they were really popular. So people were cheering for them. So the state had to kind of come in and say, look at these people. They're destroying their own industry. They're dummies. They're against progress. They're fighting against just technology and advancement in general. They're deluded. That was the favorite word. They were deluded. And they would always suggest that they were under the influence of some malcontented leader, because common people at the time couldn't be trusted to, act on their own accord or to understand what was bad for them.
You're making me think about some of the ways in which people are beginning to fight back now, including something we talked about on the show a couple of weeks ago. University of Chicago made a tool for artists that they could shade their artwork so that if it's scraped from the web, it can harm the models. Not quite a hammer.
Though that's Luddism for sure. I think the nightshade tool, turning the technology, against itself. You could point at the activists who were putting cones on self-driving cars to shut them down in their tracks.
I was thinking about that.
Then you have all the sort of mass outpouring of opposition to generative AI is probably the biggest one, all the way from, the writers in the WGA who opposed studios using AI to sort of generate scripts, and that became a key sort of factor in the strike that took most of last year. SAG similarly.
Well, you described that as kind of the first proxy battle, really, between humans and machines, in a sense, for the modern era.
Yeah, it was a really big one, and I think also was more organized, right? Like, so the Writers Guild and Hollywood screenwriters are a very organized creative industry. Then that got the spotlight, and because they were able to sort of unite their membership and sort of fight for this demand, and ultimately they won the right to kind of move AI or the use of AI into their part of the labor process, right? The studio wanted to be able to generate scripts and then take it to the writers and say, rewrite it, make it good, and we'll pay you less because it's already there. And the writers knew first of all, no, that's going to be more work, and we're not going to get the IP, we're not going to get residuals and all that kind of thing. It's going to be used as a tool to sort of break down our working conditions. Instead, they said, well, if we want AI to be on the table, then we'll decide how to use it because we know best anyways. We're the ones who've been writing and practicing this trade, and maybe there's interesting ways to experiment with it, but not setting it against our interests. If it really is supposed to be this liberatory tool that enhances creativity, then give it to the people that actually want to use it that way, not to, hit a button and sort of generate mush to meet a quota or something. So I think that was a really telling battle. And it's interesting because, I've been a tech journalist for 15 years, and you would never see something so pointed, like a resistance or a rejection to a certain technology. Like, it wasn't really an arrow in the quiver. It wasn't like a tool on the tool belt that people felt like they could do it. Just say no. And that is very Luddite. And that's another reason I think we've seen this renaissance. I talked to Alex Winter for the piece, Bill from Bill and Ted's. And actually, a tech critic himself. He's made a bunch of great documentaries about the tech industry and its impacts. And he was like, yeah, I find the Luddites a kindred spirit. I think the modern labor movements in a lot of ways is a Luddite movement. We are rejecting what the bosses or what the tech companies are kind of foisting upon us for the means of profit, not for the means of making anybody's lives better or improving workers' lives or even oftentimes the consumer's life. And it's used to try to streamline profit flows a lot of times and very little else. That's often what automation does. So he's saying that's a lot of how they expect to get their gains these days. It's not just about making a better product. A lot of the modern labor fights, especially those that generate a lot of headlines and sympathy, are kind of Luddite battles where people finally find the courage to say, no, the way that you want to use this technology is going to exploit me. It's going to make my life worse. And for 20 years or so, people didn't feel comfortable doing that because they didn't want to be seen as the old version of the Luddites, where you were being seen as backwards looking or hating progress or standing in the way of progress.
And you quote Cory Doctorow in your work as well. That was something I had to stop and think about.
Yeah, Cory has kind of declared all of science fiction a Luddite literature because it's concerned with asking what technology does, who it does it for, and who it does it to. I think it's a great formulation. Molly Crabapple, the great artist and outspoken critic of generative AI, also puts it, we need to ask who technology serves. Technology was never supposed to be this, master tool that just colonizes everything. It's supposed to have use cases and serve people. So Luddism, I think, and modern Luddism is giving people a framework to sort of ask those questions and say, okay, well, yeah, that is interesting, and it's maybe undeniably kind of a sophisticated technology, but who does it benefit? Who wins out of this equation? And if we win a little bit, who wins a lot, and at what cost? So I think these questions are much more in the air now and are much more sort of, the space has opened up to interrogate, especially the big tech companies after the last 10 years. And
yeah, well, I don't think too many tech journalists wanted to be called Luddites, and that's probably what would have happened.
Yeah. And they still don't. I'm doing my best. I like to joke that I was probably the first tech columnist Luddite, like open pro Luddite tech columnist. So they're not incompatible, and I will beat this drum till the day I die.
So you've been working on this for a while now, this your book, this research.
Yeah.
How did it come to be? What was the spark?
I was working at Vice, at Motherboard, Vice's tech outlet at the time, and it was really just kind of happenstance. It was kind of at the moment in the mid 2010s, I think 2014 or so, when there were more unignorable signs that the sands were shifting. There's so many reports about Amazon's sort of abuses at its distribution centers, and the story that always sticks in my mind is the one where I think it was in Ohio, where they had a distribution center that had no AC and there was a heat wave. And rather than installing air conditioning or telling workers to slow down, they just hired ambulances, private ambulance companies, to idle in the parking lot when people inevitably sort of passed out from heat exhaustion, and then they just take them right to the hospital. We started seeing Uber, who had sort of bounded onto the scene with a bunch of hype and venture capital at its back, promising more money to livery cab drivers if they would switch over. It would be great for cities. It would reduce congestion. It would do all these things. And then 6 or 7 years into the story, you have drivers sleeping in their cars because they can't afford to pay rent because they've systematically lowered their pay and introduced all these gamified elements where you have to keep chasing bonuses to make a decent amount of money. And it just became untenable. And meanwhile, a lot of those taxi driving jobs were either crushed or went away. Black car companies dried up because of the competition. Those sort of kinds of tech companies were starting to show their colors. And then I found this paper. My partner is an academic, and she just had like this anthology that had this paper about the Luddites that was kind of seeking to like distill their true motives, and it was kind of a defense of what they were actually all about. And it really just kind of set this light bulb off. It was like, oh, if we were wrong about this, like the sort of ultimate slander for somebody who doesn't get technology or is opposed to technology as an anti-technology moron, a Luddite, if we're wrong about that, if we have that completely wrong. So it did kind of send me down the rabbit hole. Automation was kind of being talked about, this fourth industrial revolution, or as some people have termed it, or the second machine age, or it's been given a lot of terms, but it's been sort of quote unquote coming for quite some time. So there was that sort of direct parallel between, automation concerns and, the Luddites fighting what was at the time maybe the first round of major systematized job automation.
We'll be back right after this.
Over the course of this research, has anything surprised you?
What continued to surprise me was just how, like, kind of like one-to-one, like these stories, how similar it was, like how the tech industry of today behaves like the sort of the entrepreneurial elite, you could say, of that time. You wouldn't call it, maybe it's a little glib, but just kind of to really drive the point home in the book, I call the first sort of factory owners, the first tech titans. And I don't do it just for simplicity's sake. I do it because there are a ton of similarities. They are using pretty much the same playbook. So then as now, there's a bunch of people sort of experimenting with technology, modding the hand looms, making things more suited to the way that they like to use it, or improving the rate of production. And so you have tons and tons of people contributing to that. We only remember a handful of people, like Richard Arkwright, who became sort of the, quote, grandfather of the factory system. And he did patent a device called the water frame that kind of automated the process of spinning yarn. Well, he hooked it up to water power and patented this device that would do it automatically. Of course, it turns out that he didn't actually invent it. He took the patent from another inventor. He partnered with somebody who was more technologically sort of astute than he was, elbowed him out of the picture. And the whole time I'm reading about this history, I'm thinking of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Steve Wozniak was the hardware guy inventing everything. And then Steve Jobs kind of, says like, oh, well, we got to do it this way, do that. And he does all the business side, and everybody remembers Steve Jobs. And meanwhile, countless inventors and countless hackers and modders are sort of left in the dustbin of history. Meanwhile, what the other element of his success isn't that, oh, this was just such a great device that he just like sold it to everybody and sort of made a little bit of profit. And no, he marshaled it into the factory, which at the time looked to everybody like a debtor's prison or a workhouse or a place where people would be punished. And they were horrified of these things, which is why 2/3 of them were run by children who didn't really have a say whether or not they worked there. They came from orphanages or were sent by their poor parents or so on and so forth. Anyways, he builds these factories, and the business theorist Andrew of the day says that his great innovation was not his technological acumen. And he says this approvingly, right? He says that his great contribution to history was his ability to sort of break the spirits of people who otherwise would not want to sit at a factory doing repetitive work, sort of in service of pursuing ultimate productivity. So that was the great sort of breakthrough here that sort of allowed him to become so wealthy. He set up the factories, he divided labor so ruthlessly, had the overseer, making sure everybody was in order. He deprived them of the freedom to go out and walk and take breaks, sing songs, or do the other things that weavers did to make their lives more interesting and more bearable at home when they're weaving in their cottage. They had agency. So I'm seeing in this guy this stew of, Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, where ultimately Jeff Bezos' sort of big contribution is the massive productivity that he's able to squeeze. What makes that product go from a factory floor in Ohio to your living room in 6 days? An immense amount of human labor that has to be corralled, surveilled, and made sure to be working as efficiently as possible. So I'm seeing sort of the template there. And then you go down the line, how did they respond when workers first organized and they argued that these new factories were just running roughshod over all of the regulations and laws that had governed the trade for 200 years. And they were, right? There was rules like you have to have an apprentice work for 7 years before he can join the trade. You cannot just employ people who have not been apprenticed. You have to meet certain thread count requirements. And what was their argument? Basically, it was like, that's outmoded. These are new technologies. It doesn't apply. So I'm just looking at that and I'm seeing Uber when they go into a city and people are saying, hey, we have taxi codes. We have municipal laws that govern this sort of thing. You're breaking all of them. And Uber's basically saying, we're a software company. We're just connecting people. We're not a cab company. Even though you pick up your phone and hail a driver to come to your door, that part's not us. And then so they basically were able to, because they were so well financed, they were able to sort of break down the door and, take whatever infractions, fight whatever legal battles until they had sort of, monopolized that part of the sector and the service. And Uber became too big to fail. The cloth workers eventually, became too big to fail. And they, as a result, a lot of people did starve. And the Luddites rose up and waged this huge popular rebellion. And it took years and years and decades of fighting to get things like the minimum wage, to get things like the right to organize, to get, protections for workers. We talk about the ways that, technology made people's lives better. Well, technology made a handful of people's lives better first. And then ordinary people working the technology had to fight and claw for decades and decades to ensure that they shared in some of those gains. There's a real risk that we'll see a similar dynamic play out now if it isn't already.
What are you watching for next?
I am watching for the ways that AI companies in particular start selling their services. Last year, 2023, was all about building hype, right? This is my read on it anyways. So we saw Sam Altman and co. going around saying, this is the most powerful technology that, the world has ever faced. We better be careful with it. Otherwise it might destroy humanity. To me, that's like one kind of way to do marketing, like doom marketing. So if you're like, oh my God, it's so powerful, like I got to try it, oh my God, if my competitors are using this technology that's so powerful that it could extinguish humanity, I'm not going to have a chance unless I hear their pitch about how it can benefit my enterprise. And we're seeing all these new tiers emerge that are specifically targeted at enterprise businesses. We're seeing deals being made. We're seeing partnerships because right now, generative AI costs a ton to use. Its energy demands are enormous. Its server demands, its compute demands are enormous. So it has a huge sort of footprint, and all that costs a lot of money. And so far, they're making peanuts, basically kind of selling access to higher tiers of it. So the big question for me is, how do they make this case?
This episode was produced by me and Emma Silikans and mixed by Garrett Lang, with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.